Risk of Rain 2 is a third-person action roguelike where you can go from this to this. In this video, I'll cover the narrative of the game, its main objectives, actions, and interactions, and finally, its outcomes. I'll also briefly touch on the other modes included within the game. The narrative of Risk of Rain is not its main focus, but there is still a narrative that provides more depth to the environment and characters. Risk of Rain 2 has a logbook which contains item descriptions, character backstories, monster backstories, and location lore. Using the logbook, players can piece together the lore of Risk of Rain. Risk of Rain 2's narrative continues from where Risk of Rain 1 left off. Both games focus on the planet Petrichor 5 and its hostile environment that the main characters, the survivors, must traverse. In Risk of Rain 1, the UAS Contact Light, a cargo ship, was tasked with making a shipment delivery but received a strange request that resulted in the ship's crew being led to Petrichor 5's system. The ship was then attacked 5 days later by a being known as Providence, which resulted in it crash landing on Petrichor 5. Most of the crew died, leaving only a few survivors alive. Risk of Rain 1 ends with the player escaping the planet as a survivor after killing Providence. Risk of Rain 2 centers around the crew of the UAS Safe Travels, who are trying to find the UAS Contact Light and any survivors on Petrichor 5. The final bosses of Risk of Rain 1 and 2, Providence and Mithrix, respectively, are brothers. Providence was committed to collecting the various monsters on Petrichor 5 because otherwise they would go extinct. Mithrix, however, was much more interested in designing machines and constructs. Mithrix was eventually caught by Providence in the act of destroying one of his monsters. During this time, Mithrix was also building a teleporter to reach the moon of Petrichor 5. Providence would then trick Mithrix into using the teleporter first and would trap him on the moon with no way back. While Mithrix was imprisoned on the moon, he was also constructing a teleporter to the Earth. The reason he was doing this is because Providence's main goal was to capture humanity and add them to his collection. Mithrix basically wanted to build this teleporter, teleport to Earth, and then wipe out humanity to get back at Providence for trapping him on the moon. Risk of Rain 2 has you stop him before he can do this. That about wraps up the lore for Risk of Rain 2. Now we can move on to the objectives and what to expect in a normal run. Runs in Risk of Rain 2 always begin with the player selecting one of 14 survivors to play, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses, abilities, and alternate abilities. After picking a character, the player can also choose one of 3 difficulties: Drizzle, if you're a baby, Rainstorm, which is the normal difficulty, and Monsoon, which is the hardest difficulty available to the player. There are also unlockable artifacts which the player can discover that, when enabled, change certain aspects of your run. After selecting a character and difficulty, the game can be broken down into 4 main phases: the drop-in/exploration, looting, the teleport event, and finally, the endgame, which has 2 phases of its own: the pillar phase and the Mithrix final boss fight. The first 3 phases are consistent throughout levels 1 to 5, with the 6th stage being the Mithrix fight. Runs in Risk of Rain 2 also feature a difficulty meter, which increases over time, increasing the health and damage of monsters, as well as their spawn rate. In the exploration phase, the player's main goal is to explore the level and take note of the locations of various chests, shrines, printers, and shops, as well as the teleporter. Each level in Risk of Rain 2 has the potential to take place on one of 3 stages, with the 5th always being the same. However, the 6th will vary if and when the player loops. I'll talk about what looping is in a bit, but for now, I'll focus on a normal run. The exploration phase is usually grouped with the looting phase, as monsters begin to spawn during your run while exploring, giving you the ability to gain gold, which is used to open chests and shops. The looting phase is where the player will focus on obtaining items from chests, chance shrines, and printers in order to make themselves stronger both before and after the teleporter event. The teleporter phase involves the player standing within the teleporter radius until it reaches 100% charge, allowing the player to progress to the next level. The teleporter will never reach 100% so long as the boss monster remains alive. Once the player has fought their way through the first 4 stages, the player will have a choice between looping their run or progressing to the moon and confronting Mithrix. Looping will send the player back to the first level, retaining the current difficulty level. This allows the player to obtain more items before confronting Mithrix. However, it also increases the likelihood of death because of the much stronger monsters that will now spawn. If the player chooses not to loop, they are sent to the moon where the final phases of the run will occur. The first phase, being the pillar phase, can be skipped with certain items and characters, but is often mandatory in most runs as it allows the player to access Mithrix's arena, regardless of the items that they may have. The pillar phase is quite similar to the teleporter phase, requiring the player to charge 4 pillars. There are also 4 varieties of pillars: the Pillar of Mass, which take the longest to charge, the Pillars of Soul, which have a radius that shrinks as they're charged, the Pillars of Design, which release shockwaves that knock the player away and slow their movement, and Pillars of Blood, which rapidly drain player HP while charging. Upon charging 4 pillars, the player must make their way to a launch pad which will send them up to Mithrix's arena. Mithrix's fight consists of 4 phases. The first is relatively simple, with Mithrix mostly dashing around and hitting the player with his hammer. The second phase has Mithrix briefly leave the arena and summon his Lunar Chimera, which the player must kill. The third phase has Mithrix return to the arena with a much stronger moveset. Lastly, the fourth phase has a weakened Mithrix steal your items before slowly attacking you. As you hit Mithrix in this phase, your items are slowly returned to you. Once Mithrix is dead, the player must escape the moon by charging the rescue ship. Aside from Mithrix, there are 2 other ways to end your run. You can either obliterate yourself from existence via a Celestial Portal on Loop Stage 3, or confront another boss known as the Voidling, which is significantly more difficult than Mithrix without the proper items. That about summarizes the gameplay of a regular run in Risk of Rain 2. Now, we can move on to actions and interactions, specifically the items. Risk of Rain 2 really shines when talking about its actions and interactions, specifically the items and the methods of obtaining them. Currently, items come in 7 varieties: common or white, uncommon or green, legendary or red, equipment or orange, trophy or yellow, lunar or light blue, and void, purple. White items are the most common and tend to have little to no impact or be great when stacked. Green items are slightly less common than white items and are pretty solid on average. Red items can turn the tide of a run in your favor easily, and their effects tend to be the most impactful in terms of the standard items, being white, green, and red. Equipment items, or orange items, are a lot different than white, green, red, purple, and light blue items, because you're only allowed to have one of them at any given time, unless you're playing multi, which is a character who has an ability to carry 2 equipment at once. Equipment items are usable items that do something at the press of a button, with a few exceptions, such as the Executive card, which instead gives 10% gold back on shop purchases and allows players to purchase more than one item from a shop. Trophy items, or yellow items, are boss-specific drops that range from being hot garbage to absolutely insane. Light blue, or lunar items, are items that have drawbacks, but with some pretty massive benefits, such as shaped glass, which doubles your damage but halves your HP. Lunar items are also only obtainable from lunar pods or from the Bazaar Between Time, which is only accessible through lunar portals that spawn at the end of a teleporter event. Players are able to guarantee a lunar portal at the end of their teleporter event by finding a Shrine of the Newt, which are hidden shrines throughout any given level, and upon interacting with them, summon a blue orb, which guarantees a lunar portal spawning. Void, or purple items, are the newest tier of items added to Risk of Rain 2. They're obtainable exclusively through Void Cradles, which cost 50% of your health to open. Upon picking up a Void item, they immediately corrupt their corresponding items, merging the 2. For example, if you had a white item and found its Void counterpart, all of that white item would then be turned into the Void counterpart upon pickup. This also applies to future pickups of that said white item. Items can be mainly obtained in 5 ways: chests, printers, shops, shrines, and scavengers. Chests appear throughout every level, containing an item of random rarity. Large chests contain uncommon or better items. Shops contain 3 items, but the player is only able to choose one of the 3. Shrines of Chance spawn around the map and have a 60% chance of giving the player an item, and a 40% chance of doing nothing. Every time a Shrine of Chance is used, its cost increases. This typically results in the player ending up spending more money at a shrine should they choose to continue gambling. The first use of a Shrine of Chance is always cheaper than a small chest, which makes it extremely cost efficient if you are able to get an item from the first roll. It's also important to note that after using a Shrine of Chance to get 2 items, the shrine will become inert. There are also other types of shrines that can spawn throughout a run, but for the sake of simplicity, we can just skip over them. Scavengers are bosses that spawn throughout looped levels, possessing a backpack that they drop when they are killed, which gives the player several random items. Last but certainly not least, printers can be found on most stages and allow the player to convert an item whose rarity corresponds to that of the item being displayed in the printer. If the player doesn't want to risk trading a good item, scrappers can also be found throughout most levels, which allow the player to turn their unwanted items into scrap that is prioritized when printing. Printers are insanely important for stacking white items to make them the most effective they can be. Items that perform well at high stat counts benefit the most from printing. Another important mechanic within Risk of Rain 2 is chain activation of items, or simply chain procking. Items that have on-hit effects, and what's referred to as a proc coefficient, are capable of activating your other items when they activate, leading to some pretty insane combinations. This mechanic is what Risk of Rain 2 is mainly known for. Aside from objects and interactions, there are also a few outcomes that can result from a run in Risk of Rain 2. There aren't many outcomes, however, with there only being 3 total. You can die, which results in a defeat. You can kill Mithrix and result in a victory screen. You can kill the Voidling and result in a Fate Unknown ending. Or you can also obliterate at an obelisk and also receive the same Fate Unknown ending. As I briefly mentioned earlier in the video, Risk of Rain 2 also has other modes such as multiplayer, prismatic trials, eclipse, and simulacrum. Multiplayer is a really fun experience and can result in some pretty hilarious character compositions. Simulacrum is essentially an endless wave survival that only ends when you die. Eclipse, my personal favorite to play Risk of Rain 2, is a typical monsoon run, only it has stacking modifiers which make the game much harder. As for prismatic trials, no one really cares about those, so we'll just skip them. With all that said and done, that's about it for my Risk of Rain 2 review. I hope you enjoyed.